is, why would I do these videos when, and this is what comes through, I am an old, overweight English man. Why would I, as an old fat white guy, come on YouTube, expose myself like this, and talk about being a tough Nietzschean when I could probably not fight my way out of a paper bag? Why would I go on about the Superman when I'm clearly over? So, to address these questions, which usually pop up when my interlocutors have lost the argument, but they need addressing. Quickly, I've mentioned before in other videos that tough Nietzscheans refers to a period of Nietzsche reception prior to the Second World War. The hard-headed approach and interpretation of Nietzsche, which comes through the Oscar Levy translations. It is then superseded after the Second World War immediately with a softer Nietzsche interpretation, spearheaded, of course, by Kauffmann, Hollingdale and Montanari. So the concept of this is to push against this prevailing soft Nietzschean notion, which is all over the place now, including social media, hence my use of YouTube, and to put the case for the tough Nietzschean interpretation. It has nothing to do with my personal toughness or lack of. And similarly, with the Superman, etc., our view is the evolutionary view that Nietzsche is positing a new species to evolve. Again, nothing to do with lifting weights and being a super fit fighter and all the rest of it. And also this Nietzsche's military school of life is not a literal military, although it derives from that and can be reflected in that. It is the philosophy that derives from military, hunting and combat, the sort of philosophy that's far and wide in Sun Tzu, in the Hagakure, in von Clausewitz, and of course in Nietzsche and Machiavelli. So I hope that brief outline shows I'm not making excuses, purely this is the philosophy. And of course, I've not always been old, I've not always been fat, though I have always been white and English. I first become fully aware of Nietzsche through a teacher when I was about 18 mentioning I should read The Outsider by Camus. I didn't really catch that surname. I just caught the Outsider title by a French writer as I thought. I went to a local library and asked for The Outsider, and they gave me Wilson's book. I thought it can't be the same book, as the writer of the mentioned by the teacher was a French writer, but when I looked at the contents, I thought this is in the same area, so I borrowed that book, Colin Wilson's Outsider. This is a later addition to the one that I had, which was from the library. And that book has an excellent chapter on Nietzsche, or a section on Nietzsche. It's not a tough Nietzschean view, but Colin Wilson was a kind of tough, hard-headed writer anyway, and a writer I enjoyed more broadly. But that started me off with the interest in Nietzsche. At the time, when I was 18, I looked like that. So I was slim, fairly fit, but with extremely long hair. Kind of a Spartan youth, perhaps. And I studied art, history, English, and music at college. I did after A-levels, I did a year's foundation in art, But when I was at art college, I was always doing music. And so I went to music college for 3 years studying classical music. But when I was at music college, I began to read philosophy much more seriously. And after leaving college, I carried on doing evening courses in anything from art history to politics to philosophy to art. And this went on into my 30s, when in my early 30s, maybe about 32, I decided to take Nietzsche very seriously and spend a whole year reading all of Nietzsche's works. For a year, taking notes as I went, and I decided my idea was to use Ecce Homo as the guide for reading Nietzsche. So, as I've mentioned probably before, and I didn't get the idea from anybody else, it just occurred to me that I would read Ecce Homo, then I would read the chapter on the birth of tragedy, then read the birth of tragedy. Go back to Ecce Homo and read the chapter on human all too human, and well, I've left out the untimely meditations there, and go through all the books in chronological order as set out in Ecce Homo, and then read the Antichrist, which isn't mentioned there, and then the Will to Power, which was the culminating book as far as I was concerned at that time. Now, at that time, when I looked like this, still slim, still fit, still young, I was reading the Kauffmann and Hollingdale translations. This is my portable Nietzsche, the one that I had at that time. So I still have that. So I hadn't really got au fait with the different perspectives on Nietzsche. I just took the Kauffmann Hollingdale version as the accepted one. But it wasn't until I think I came across this book, a source book on fascism, and in there I started to realize how Nietzsche had influenced fascism. And I thought, well, how was that possible? Because Kauffmann is telling us that Nietzsche was an anti-fascist. And it can't have all been down to his sister, surely, because I knew then that he published his own books in his own time when he was alive, and she had nothing to do with that. So I began to think that there was another interpretation of Nietzsche. And yes, I found that by going back to the original Oscar Levy translations in English, the ones that Kauffmann had been so spiteful about, and found there with the essays and the translations and the books by those writers involved in that translation, such as Levy, such as Ludovici and others. And I found there that tough Nietzschean interpretation, and I also became fascinated with the influence that Nietzsche had on the Third Reich, on the philosophy of the Third Reich, and so on and so forth. Now, we are talking here in the pre-internet age. All I've mentioned so far, all the studying I did up till then, was purely in libraries, purely from bookshops, and when I did my year on Nietzsche, when I took notes on all his books, at that time, these are the notebooks. This is notes taken for that single year of reading Nietzsche. These are all the notes I took from the books. And that really is where I consolidated my knowledge of Nietzsche. I spent a whole year, didn't go out, didn't do anything. I just sat in and read Nietzsche and took notes on Nietzsche for a solid year. But as I say, I was still using the Kauffmann translations. But already at that point, I'd started to be aware of things like paganism, things like the Norse paganism, which has certain implications for a political ideology, as found in the far right interpretation of Nietzsche, as we will call it. In this pre-internet age, I started to make contact with far right groups through post office numbers, because the only stuff you could get like this was still very much filtered. So even though this is an excellent book because it gives us sources, they are still excerpted sources, and there is still a lot of moralistic acid poured all over it, condemning at every turn. What I needed to find was the pure, unadulterated, far-right, Third Reich material, the Nietzsche-influenced material. And I can only get that through going to those far-right groups who existed at the time, through the post office boxes. And that's where I got my copy of Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, Hitler's Table Talk, and so on and so forth. It's where I actually was able to meet David Irving once and got many of his books also. So I started to amass quite a lot of knowledge of Nietzsche's influence on what we would call the far-right scene as such. I do not consider myself a member of that scene or an activist in that scene as such. I was purely viewing it through the influence of a philosopher on a political landscape. Getting away from just philosophy as a pure airy-fairy thing, seeing how philosophy works in praxis, as it did in the Third Reich, and indeed in the post-war, what we might call the fascist underground, the Nazi underground. And then we look at the people like Savitri Devi, who is a very fine philosopher in her own right. We look at Serrano and others who are often mentioned in this connection. So that's where I was going in the pre-internet age, as the internet age was actually dawning also at that time. And as the internet age was dawning, I did a correspondence course, still pre-internet, although he did have a website. It was a correspondence course on Greek philosophy, where I concentrated on the pre-Socratics, writing essays on the pre-Socratics, a full correspondence course on that, but I would say at degree level. And then a few years later, I did a extramural course, they called it, so a part-time evening course at the University of London. Again, a degree course level, probably higher, on continental philosophy, where I concentrated, of course, on Nietzsche, again writing lots of essays. So that was all probably about 10 to 15 years ago now. So that's my background in Nietzsche. So I've really lived and breathed Nietzsche on and off, more intense in some periods than others, for the best part of 40 years. Now, philosophy is one of those disciplines, probably the first discipline which valued age. It didn't value youth like our present culture, the youth culture, where everyone who ages wants to look younger and tries to look younger. Philosophy, in ancient times, valued the sages, the greybeards, the old men. It valued them because they had lived through decades, and while there is no fool like an old fool, that's true, at least if you've lived through decades, then you have a deeper understanding of someone who hasn't lived for 20 years. By a process of osmosis, you take in the influences, and that gives you a deeper knowledge, even if you are an old fool. So I make no excuses for being old. In fact, in philosophy, it's a definite advantage, and it's no coincidence that many of the great philosophers were, of course, old men. And yes, philosophy is something that you come to usually at the end of your life or the last parts of your life. Now, there are some exceptions. We know that Schopenhauer wrote his main work when he was in his 20s. But of course, he kept thinking, he kept writing his whole life. And he widened and deepened his knowledge his whole life. So I make no excuse for being old, of course. As for being fat, well, as you get older, I think you realize that everything you do in your life leaves a mark on you, on your body, whether internally or externally. And I must admit, I've had Dionysian periods in my life where I've eaten too much, drank too much, and taken too much. And those things do leave their mark, even though I don't do anything like that now and haven't done for a few years. The weight increases, it comes down, it increases, it comes down, but with every increase, there's more accumulated until you get to the point where probably I am now, where it's very difficult to lose weight unless you really try. And I'm not going to really try. And of course, with things like drinking, where I may have spent time drinking whiskey, half a bottle of whiskey every day for a couple of years, that damages your internal organs, of course. When you're younger, you don't really care, even if you know about it, and you don't really know about it. But of course, the damage you cause to your internal organs starts to trouble you when you get much older. And so my weight gain and other things that may trouble my health are due to those excesses of my youth. And do I regret those? No. Because Nietzschean philosophy tells me to love my fate. Amor fati. In fact, it goes further to suggest that all those choices I made, I willed them to happen. I willed the excesses of drinking and eating and taking things. And whatever damage they did to me, whatever accumulated damage I have today, they at least opened up experiences in me that I would be poorer for if I had not had them. So I do not regret them. Why do I do this? Well, I've mentioned before that it was watching Essential Salts, his videos, presenting the softer Nietzschean approach, but cloaking it as if he was a hard Nietzschean, which he wasn't. And his videos are excellently produced. He is a very smooth talker. So I thought, well, what about if an old fat white guy like me goes on in front of a phone camera, in a spare room, and just starts to talk off the top of his head, ad lib, no script, from the heart, from the head, and from the bowels, and just gives whoever's watching the benefit of his experience of Nietzsche's work and his thinking about Nietzsche's work and his conviction that Nietzsche is the most important philosopher of the modern age. And that's it. That's why I do it.